Hey everyone, tonight we're venturing into the darkest depths of the Dune universe to uncover one of its most chilling truths. The story of how Paul Atreides, the Chosen One, the prophesied Messiah, became something far more terrifying than any sandworm that ever stalked the deep desert. This is the tale of a hero's transformation into the greatest monster the galaxy has ever known. So, before we begin this journey into the abyss of power and prophecy, take a moment to hit that like button. If you're ready for tonight's exploration, don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into complex mythology. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're listening from tonight. Now, get comfortable, perhaps dim those lights, settle into your favorite listening spot, and prepare yourself for a tale that will challenge everything you thought you knew about heroes and villains. Picture this, if you will. The year is 10,208 after Guild. 12 long years since young Duke Paul Atreides first set foot on the burning sands of Arrakis, the desert planet that forged him, broke him, and ultimately crowned him as the most powerful ruler the known universe has ever witnessed. In the towering spires of Arrakis, within the fortress palace that now serves as the seat of galactic dominion, there sits a man who commands the loyalty of 1 trillion souls across 10,000 worlds. His name is whispered in prayers and curses alike. They call him Muad'Dib, the desert mouse who became a god. They call him the Mahdi, the one who leads to paradise. They call him Emperor Paul Atreides, ruler of the known universe. But tonight, we will discover what he truly became. And it is something that will haunt your dreams long after the last grain of sand has settled. The truth begins with a vision, as all the most terrifying truths do. In the depths of his prescient sight, Paul Atreides sees a future that makes his blood run cold. He sees himself standing atop a mountain of 60 billion corpses, their lifeless eyes reflecting the twin moons of 1,000 conquered worlds. He sees the green and black banners of Atreides flying over the smoking ruins of civilizations that dared to resist his holy war. But that is not the worst of it. The true horror lies in what comes after. For in his visions, Paul sees the moment when the mask finally slips completely away, when the last vestiges of the idealistic young Duke are consumed by the ravenous hunger of absolute power. And on one particular night, as the desert wind howls through the palace corridors like the wails of the damned, Paul awakens from a vision so clear and so immediate that he can still feel the blood on his hands. In this vision, he stands in the very room where he now sleeps, but it is different. The walls are decorated not with the green and black of Atreides, but with something far more sinister. In this vision, a figure approaches him. Someone he knows, someone he loves, someone whose trust he has cherished above all else. But their eyes are filled with a horror so profound that it seems to reach across time and space to clutch at his heart. And they speak words that will echo through the chambers of his mind for all the days to come, words that reveal the final terrible truth of what Paul Atreides has become. But who is this figure? What do they say that fills the Emperor of the known universe with such dread? What truth could be so devastating that it would drive a man who has seen the birth and death of stars to the very edge of madness? The answer lies in the shadows of the next 12 years of Paul's reign, in the political machinations and deadly conspiracies that swirl around him like the great storms of the deep desert. It lies in the slow, insidious corruption of everything he once held sacred, in the gradual transformation of a hero into something that defies the very concept of heroism. Tonight, we will trace that transformation step by step, moment by moment, choice by choice. We will witness how the young man who once wept for the death of a single loyal soldier learned to calculate the deaths of billions with the cold precision of a mentat. We will see how the Duke who once promised to be a just ruler became an emperor who rules through terror and religious fanaticism. This is not just a story about the corruption of power. This is a story about the price of prescience, about the curse of seeing too clearly into the future, about the terrible burden of knowledge that turns salvation into damnation. It is a story about a man who tried to save the universe and in doing so became its greatest threat. The sand remembers all things, they say. And what it remembers of Paul Atreides will shake you to your very core. In the crimson dawn of Arrakis, where twin suns cast their eternal judgment upon the endless dunes, the palace of Muad'Dib rises like a monument to divine power. Its walls, carved from the living rock of Shield Wall, stretch toward the heavens, as if reaching for the very stars that Paul Atreides now commands. Here, in chambers that echo with the whispers of a trillion subjects, the God Emperor begins each day with the weight of prescient knowledge, pressing upon his consciousness like the crushing depth of the deep desert. Paul Atreides sits upon the lion throne, fashioned from a single block of haggle quartz that seems to pulse with its own inner light. The throne room stretches before him like a cathedral of power, its vaulted ceiling painted with the constellations of every world that bows before his name. Pillars of polished obsidian rise from the floor like the bones of some ancient leviathan, each one inscribed with the names of the 61 billion souls who have died in his name during the holy war that swept across the galaxy like wildfire. But it is not the grandeur of his surroundings that defines this moment. It is the man himself, or rather, what the man has become. Gone is the uncertain youth who once stood trembling before the Reverend Mother's Gom Jabbar. Gone is the reluctant Duke who wept for his father's death and sought only justice for his people. In their place sits something far more complex, far more terrifying. A being who has gazed into the infinite corridors of time and seen the price of every choice, the consequence of every action, the weight of every life that hangs in the balance of his will. His eyes, those blue within blue orbs that mark him as one touched by the spice, no longer see merely the present moment. They pierce through the veils of time itself, witnessing futures that branch and twist like the roots of a nightmare tree. In those eyes burns the knowledge of what he has become, and more frightening still, what he must yet become. Standing at his side is Stilgar, the Nabe who once taught a frightened boy the ways of the desert. But the old Fremen looks upon his Emperor now with eyes that hold more fear than love, more duty than devotion. The weathered face that once smiled with paternal pride now bears the weight of terrible understanding. For Stilgar has seen what 12 years of absolute power can do to even the most noble soul. The morning reports usual, Stilgar says, his voice carrying the careful formality that has replaced their old familiarity. He no longer calls Paul by the intimate name of friend, but by the title that acknowledges the vast chasm that now separates them. The reports speak of worlds brought to heel, of resistance movements crushed beneath the boots of Fremen legions, of entire populations relocated to serve the spice harvest that feeds the Empire's insatiable hunger. Paul listens to each report with the detached attention of a man who has already seen these events unfold in the theater of his prescient mind. 70,000 dead on Naraj Prime, their crime the simple act of refusing to convert to the religion of Muad'Dib. 12 billion relocated from the agricultural worlds of Bela Tegus to make way for spice processing facilities. 100 minor houses, stripped of their ancestral holdings for the sin of questioning the divine mandate of their emperor. Number is recited with bureaucratic precision, each tragedy reduced to statistics in the vast calculus of imperial administration. But Paul remembers when such numbers would have brought him to his knees with grief. Now they wash over him like grains of sand in the wind, noticed but not truly felt, acknowledged but not mourned. In the shadows of the throne room stands another figure, one whose presence brings both comfort and unease to the Emperor's troubled soul. Gurney Halleck, the loyal retainer who once taught Paul the warrior's way with blade and shield. But time has changed them both, and the man who once sang ballads of heroism now serves as the instrument of an empire built on the bones of the innocent. The Spacing Guild sends their regards, my lord, Gurney reports, his scarred face impassive as stone. Navigator Edric requests another audience. He speaks of disturbances in the prescient realm, of futures that grow dark and twisted beyond his ability to navigate. Paul's lips curve in what might once have been called a smile, but now resembles more the baring of teeth by a predator who has tasted blood. He knows what the Guild Navigator sees in his prescient visions, the same shadows that haunt Paul's own sight. They are the echoes of choices yet to be made, the reverberations of a destiny that grows more terrible with each passing day. Tell the good navigator that the future has always been dark, Paul says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. It is only now that he begins to see it clearly. But even as he speaks these words, Paul feels the familiar stirring of prescient sight behind his eyes. The throne room fades away, replaced by visions of what is to come. He sees himself standing in this very chamber, but the walls run red with blood that is not his own. He sees the faces of those he loves twisted with horror and betrayal. He sees the moment when the last vestiges of Paul Atreides die, leaving only the terrible god that men call Muad'Dib. And in the center of it all, he sees the figure from his recurring nightmare, the one whose identity he knows but dares not acknowledge, even to himself. They approach him across a floor littered with the consequences of his choices, their eyes filled with an accusation that cuts deeper than any blade. "You have become the very thing you sought to prevent," the figure says, their voice echoing with the weight of absolute truth. "You have saved humanity by destroying its soul." The vision fades, leaving Paul alone with the crushing weight of knowledge. He knows what he has become, and more terrifying still, he knows what he must yet become. For the alternative is not merely his own destruction, but the extinction of the human race itself. The prescient maze closes around him like the coils of a great serpent, each choice leading to greater horrors, each path forward demanding a higher price in blood and innocence. And at the center of it all stands Paul Atreides, no longer a man but a force of nature, a living embodiment of the terrible arithmetic that governs the fate of species. The morning sun climbs higher over Arrakis, its light filtering through the crystal windows of the throne room like the judgment of an unforgiving god. And in that light, the Emperor of the known universe contemplates the price of power, the burden of prescience, and the slow, inexorable transformation of a hero into the monster that history will remember long after the last star has burned. Cold in the void, the decision comes not as a thunderbolt of revelation, but as the slow, inevitable acceptance of a drowning man who finally stops fighting the current. Paul Atreides rises from the lion throne, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a predator who has learned to hunt in the darkness between worlds. The weight of empire settles upon his shoulders like the ceremonial robes of his office, heavy with the accumulated sins of 12 years of absolute rule. "Summon the inner council," he commands, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. "It is time we address the whispers that echo in the shadows of our empire." The whispers. Even an emperor who commands the loyalty of 1,000,000,000 souls cannot silence the murmurs that travel faster than guild navigators through the folded space of political intrigue. They speak of resistance movements that spring up like desert flowers after rain, blooming briefly before being crushed beneath the boots of Fremen legions. They tell of secret meetings held in the ruins of conquered worlds, where the surviving leaders of dead civilizations plot their desperate revenge against the tyrant who destroyed their homes. But Paul knows these whispers carry a deeper truth, one that chills him more than any threat of assassination or rebellion. They speak of a conspiracy so vast and so carefully orchestrated that it spans generations, reaching back to the very roots of human civilization itself, the Bene Gesserit. Those manipulators of bloodlines and destiny have not been idle during his reign. The Spacing Guild, dependent upon spice for their prescient navigation, grows restless as Paul's monopoly tightens around their collective throat. And in the shadows beyond the reach of even his prescient sight, the Tleilaxu masters weave there. Genetic sorcery with purposes that remain obscured by the fog of future possibilities. The council chamber fills with the familiar faces of those who have stood beside him through the long years of conquest and consolidation. Stilgar enters first, his desert-weathered features bearing the weight of unspoken doubts. The old Nabe moves with the careful precision of a man who has learned to walk on ground that might shift beneath his feet at any moment. Behind him comes Gurney Halleck, the loyal retainer whose scarred hands have spilled oceans of blood. Service to the Atreides name. His eyes, once bright with the fire of righteous anger, now hold the cold calculation of a man who has learned to measure victory in the currency of necessary atrocities. Princess Irilyn glides into the chamber with the practiced grace of one born to the intricate dance of imperial politics. Her beauty remains unmarred by the years, preserved by the subtle arts of the Bene Gesserit, but her eyes tell a different story. They hold the weight of compromises made and principles abandoned, the accumulated cost of survival in a court where truth itself has become a luxury that few can afford. And finally, Alia enters, her young face bearing the terrible wisdom of countless generations. The abomination, as the Bene Gesserit call her, carries within her consciousness the memories of every reverend mother who has ever lived and died. She is at once Paul's sister and his greatest fear, a mirror that reflects not what he is, but what he might become if he surrenders completely to the seductive whispers of absolute power. The reports from the outer worlds grow more troubling. Paul begins, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority. Resistance movements coordinate their efforts with a precision that suggests outside guidance. Someone with intimate knowledge of our methods feeds them intelligence, weapons, hope. He pauses, allowing his prescient sight to pierce through the veils of immediate time. The visions that flood his consciousness are fragmented, uncertain, clouded by the interference of other prescient minds that work to obscure the future from his sight. But through the chaos of possibility, he glimpses fragments of truth that make his blood run cold. They seek to create a moment, he continues, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A single instant when our defenses are compromised. When the God Emperor becomes merely a man, vulnerable to the blade of an assassin or the poison of a lover. The silence that follows his words carries the weight of terrible understanding. Each member of the council knows that Paul's prescient abilities make him nearly invulnerable to conventional attack. His enemies cannot simply overwhelm him with superior force or catch him unaware through stealth and deception. Instead, they must create conditions so complex and so carefully orchestrated that even his ability to see the future becomes a trap, rather than a shield. The Tleilaxu have offered us a gift, Irilyn says, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of one who has learned to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics. A gola grown from the genetic material of Duncan, Idaho. They claim it as a gesture of goodwill, a token of their submission to imperial authority. Paul's eyes narrow as he contemplates this information. Duncan, Idaho, the loyal swordmaster, who died protecting Paul's escape from the Harkonnens all those years ago. The man whose sacrifice had haunted Paul's dreams during the early years of his reign, whose memory served as a reminder of the price that others pay for the ambitions of their leaders. A gola, he repeats, tasting the word like poison on his tongue. The Tleilaxu offer us the resurrection of the dead, wrapped in the promise of redemption. But what price do they truly seek for such a gift? The question hangs in the air like the scent of spice on the desert wind, carrying with it the weight of implications that none dare speak aloud. Paul knows that the Tleilaxu masters are incapable of simple generosity, that every gift they offer comes with strings attached, threads that lead back to purposes that serve their own mysterious agenda. Through his prescient sight, Paul sees the shadowy outline of the trap that awaits him. The gola will come, bearing the face and form of beloved Duncan, Idaho, but carrying within its artificially constructed consciousness the seeds of destruction. It will be programmed to love him, to serve him, to gain his trust completely. And then, at the moment when that trust is absolute, it will become the instrument of his downfall. But even knowing this, Paul finds himself unable to refuse the offer. For in the labyrinth of prescient possibility, he sees that accepting the Gola is not a choice, but a necessity. The alternative paths lead to futures so dark and twisted that even his iron will recoil from their contemplation. The death of humanity itself, the extinction of consciousness in a universe grown cold and empty, the triumph of forces that make even his own tyranny seem like a gentle rain compared to the hurricane of absolute annihilation. "Send word to the Tleilaxu," he says finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that will echo through the corridors of eternity. "Tell them that the Emperor accepts their gift with the gratitude it deserves." The council members exchange glances heavy with unspoken understanding. They know that Paul sees more than he reveals, that his acceptance of the Gola carries implications that reach far beyond the simple resurrection of a dead friend. But they also know that questioning the prescient wisdom of their emperor is a luxury that their positions cannot afford. As the council disperses to carry out their various duties, Paul remains alone in the chamber, his consciousness drifting through the maze of future possibilities like a ship navigating treacherous waters. In the distance, he can hear the sound of approaching footsteps, the whisper of robes against stone, the soft breathing of someone who comes to him bearing news. That will change everything. The trap is set, the pieces are in motion, and the God Emperor of the known universe prepares to walk willingly into the darkness that awaits him, knowing that his damnation may be the only path to humanity's salvation. The package arrives with the ceremony befitting a gift between gods. The Tleilaxu transport vessel settles onto the landing pad of Arrakis like a metallic insect, its hull gleaming with the unnatural perfection that marks all products of their genetic artistry. Paul watches from the observation deck of his palace, his prescient sight already having shown him this moment countless times in the theater of his mind. Yet seeing it unfold in reality carries a weight that even his visions could not fully prepare him for. The cargo hold opens with a hiss of escaping atmosphere, and from within emerges a figure that makes Paul's breath catch in his throat. It is Duncan Idaho, or rather something that wears Duncan's face with such perfection that even Paul's enhanced senses cannot detect the deception. The Gola stands tall and proud, his dark hair catching the light of the Arrakis sun, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a master swordmaster. But it is the eyes that capture Paul's attention, those familiar brown eyes that once looked upon him with the devotion of a loyal friend. "My lord," the Gola says, his voice carrying the exact timbre and cadence that Paul remembers from a lifetime ago. "I am called Hate by my creators, though I am told I once bore another name in service to your house." The words are spoken with careful neutrality, but Paul can hear the confusion beneath them. This artificial man carries within his consciousness fragments of Duncan Idaho's memories, like pieces of a shattered mirror that reflect distorted images of the past. He knows that he once served House Atreides, that he died in that service, but the details remain frustratingly beyond his reach. "Duncan," Paul whispers, the name escaping his lips like a prayer to a god who no longer listens. "You died saving my life on Arrakis, fighting the Sardaukar while we escaped into the desert. You were the most loyal friend a man could ask for." The Gola's expression shifts, a flicker of something that might be recognition crossing his features. But it passes quickly, replaced by the blank politeness of one who knows he should remember, but cannot quite grasp the threads of memory that dance just beyond his conscious reach. "I have brought letters of introduction from the Tleilaxu masters," Hate continues, producing a sealed cylinder from within his robes. "They wish to formalize their submission to your imperial authority and request audience to discuss matters of mutual benefit." Paul takes the cylinder, feeling the subtle weight of the metal in his hands. Through his prescient sight, he sees the layers of meaning hidden within this simple gesture. The Tleilaxu have not merely sent him a gift, they have sent him a weapon carefully disguised as a blessing. Hate carries within his artificially constructed consciousness programming that will activate at the precise moment when Paul's guard is lowest, when his trust is most complete. But knowing this does not diminish the profound impact of seeing Duncan's face again. The Gola stands before him like a ghost made flesh, a reminder of the man Paul once was and the friend he lost in the flames of necessity. There is something deeply disturbing about the perfection of the reproduction, as if the Tleilaxu have not merely created a copy, but have somehow violated the very essence of death itself. You will be given quarters in the palace, Paul decides, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. Gurney Halleck will oversee your integration into the household guard. We will speak again when you have had time to settle into your new surroundings. As Hate is led away by the palace guards, Paul retreats to his private chambers, seeking solitude to process the enormity of what has just occurred. The rooms are vast and luxurious, filled with the treasures of 1,000 conquered worlds, yet they feel like a prison to the man who rules them. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of empire, Paul confronts the terrible isolation that comes with absolute power. He moves to the great window that overlooks the city of Arrakis, watching the endless stream of pilgrims who journey across the galaxy to worship at the shrine of their living God. They come in their millions, seeking blessing, guidance, healing, hope. They prostrate themselves before his palace walls, chanting prayers that speak of his divine nature and infinite wisdom. But Paul knows the truth that they cannot see, that the God they worship is nothing more than a man drowning in the consequences of his oses. The spice trance takes him without warning, as it often does in these moments of intense emotional turmoil. His consciousness expands beyond the confines of his physical form, piercing through the veils of time to witness the branching paths of possibility that stretch out before him. In the prescient realm, he sees the ghost of Duncan Idaho, not as he was, but as he might become. The visions show him Hate growing closer to the imperial household, earning the trust of guards and servants alike. They show him training in the palace courtyards, his artificial muscles remembering the sword work that his original consciousness mastered decades ago. They show him standing at Paul's side during court functions, his presence a constant reminder of loyalty and sacrifice. But beneath these surface images lie darker truths. Paul sees the moment when Hate's programming will activate, triggered by specific words or actions that the Tleilaxu have carefully calculated. He sees the artificial man's face contorting with anguish as he realizes what he has been created to do. He sees the blade sliding between ribs, the look of betrayal in dying eyes, the triumph of enemies who have waited decades for this moment of vulnerability. Yet even knowing this, Paul finds himself powerless to prevent it. The prescient maze has closed around him like the coils of a great serpent, each choice leading to consequences that make the alternatives seem even more terrible. If he refuses the Gola, the Tleilaxu will find other ways to attack him, methods that may prove even more devastating. If he accepts Hate but keeps him at a distance, he loses the opportunity to turn the trap against its creators. The only path forward lies through the heart of the conspiracy itself, accepting the role of victim in a drama that has been decades in the making. Paul must allow himself to grow close to this artificial Duncan, must permit the bonds of false friendship to form, must walk willingly into the trap that awaits him. For in the labyrinth of prescient possibility, he sees that his apparent defeat may be the only way to achieve ultimate victory. The irony is not lost on him. The enemies who seek to destroy him through the manipulation of his emotions have chosen their weapon well. Duncan Idaho represents everything that Paul once was, everything that he sacrificed on the altar of necessity. By sending him a Gola of his dead friend, the Tleilaxu have created a mirror that reflects not Paul's present reality, but his abandoned past. As night falls over Arrakis, Paul stands alone in his chambers, contemplating the ghost that now walks his halls. Tomorrow he will begin the delicate dance of trust and betrayal that will define the remaining years of his reign. He will allow himself to care for this artificial man, knowing that such caring will ultimately be used against him. He will permit the slow healing of wounds that have festered for decades, understanding that the healing itself is part of the trap. The god, Emperor of the known universe, closes his eyes and prepares to become human again, if only for the brief time it takes for humanity to destroy him. The weeks pass like grains of sand through an hourglass, each day bringing hate deeper into the fabric of palace life. Paul watches from the shadows of his prescient sight as the Ghola integrates himself seamlessly into the household guard, his artificial memories guiding him through the rituals of service with an efficiency that borders on the supernatural. There is something deeply unsettling about the perfection of it all, the way hate moves through the palace corridors as if he had never left, as if death itself had been nothing more than a brief interruption in his service to House Atreides. Other guards accept him with a cautious respect due to one who bears the face of a legend. They know the stories of Duncan Idaho's sacrifice, how he held the line against Sardaukar warriors while his duke and heir escaped into the desert. But they also sense something different about this version of the man, a subtle wrongness that they cannot quite articulate. He is too perfect, too precise, like a sword that has been honed to such sharpness that it cuts not just flesh but the very air around it. Paul finds himself drawn to observe hate during his training sessions in the palace courtyards. The Ghola moves through the combat forms with a fluid grace that takes Paul's breath away, his blade work displaying the same deadly artistry that made Duncan Idaho the most feared swordmaster in the Imperium. But there are differences, subtle improvements that speak to the Tleilaxu's genetic manipulation. His reflexes are faster, his strength greater, his endurance seemingly limitless. They have not simply resurrected Duncan Idaho, they have created something superior to the original. He fights like a machine, Gurney Halleck observes, his scarred face creased with concern. Perfect technique, flawless execution, but something is missing. The passion, the fire that made Duncan who he was. Paul nods, understanding the truth that Gurney has identified. The Ghola possesses all of Duncan's skills, enhanced beyond their original capabilities, but lacks the emotional depth that gave those skills meaning. He is a weapon disguised as a man, a tool crafted for a specific purpose and nothing more. Yet as the days turn to weeks, Paul begins to notice subtle changes in Hate's behavior. The artificial man starts to linger in certain areas of the palace, places where Duncan Idaho once spent time. He pauses before portraits of the old Duke Leto, his expression troubled by memories that dance just beyond his conscious reach. He asks questions about the past, probing for details that might unlock the sealed chambers of his consciousness. "Tell me about the night we fled into the desert," Hate says one evening, his voice carrying a note of desperate curiosity. "I remember fragments, pieces of a larger picture that refuses to come into focus." Paul studies the Ghola's face, seeing in it the same earnest desire for truth that once characterized his friend. "You held the rear guard while we escaped through the palace corridors. The Sardaukar were closing in, and you knew that staying behind meant certain death. But you did it anyway, because loyalty meant more to you than life itself." Something flickers in Hate's eyes, a spark of recognition that quickly fades. "I can almost see it," he whispers. The sound of blades clashing, the smell of blood and fear. "But it slips away like water through my fingers." The frustration in his voice is genuine, and Paul finds himself moved by it, despite knowing the danger that Hate represents. The Tleilaxu have created something truly cruel, a being who possesses the shadow of memory without its substance, the echo of emotion without its depth. They have made him suffer for the very programming that will eventually destroy them both. In his private moments, Paul allows his prescient sight to explore the branching paths of possibility that surround the Gola. He sees the moment when hate's true programming will activate, triggered by specific words that the Tleilaxu have embedded in his consciousness like a virus waiting for the right conditions to spread. The activation will come at the moment of greatest emotional vulnerability, when Paul's guard is completely lowered, when the artificial Duncan has succeeded in becoming real in his eyes. But Paul also sees something else, a possibility so faint and fragile that it exists only in the furthest reaches of prescient sight. There's a chance, microscopic but real, that hate's consciousness might break free from its programming. The human spirit, even in its artificial form, possesses a resilience that the Tleilaxu may have underestimated. If the Gola can somehow access the full depth of Duncan Idaho's memories, if he can reclaim not just the skills, but the soul of the man he was created to replace, then the trap might be turned against its creators. This possibility both terrifies and exhilarates Paul. To reach it, he must allow himself to form genuine emotional bonds with the Gola, must permit the healing of wounds that have festered for over a decade. He must risk everything on the chance that love might prove stronger than programming, that the human heart might triumph over Tleilaxu manipulation. The decision comes during a quiet evening in the palace gardens, where Paul often retreats to escape the crushing weight of empire. Hate finds him there, sitting beside a fountain that plays with recycled water, a luxury that only the god emperor can afford on the desert world of Arrakis. "My lord," Hate says, his voice carrying a formality that cannot quite hide the uncertainty beneath. "I have been thinking about the stories you tell, about the man I once was. They feel like dreams half remembered, like songs heard from a great distance." Paul looks up at the Gola, seeing in his face the same earnest confusion that once characterized Duncan Idaho in his youth. "What do you remember on your own, without my stories to guide you?" Hate is quiet for a long moment, his artificial mind sifting through fragments of memory like a scholar examining ancient texts. "I remember music," he says finally. "The sound of a baliset played in quiet moments between battles. I remember the smell of Caladan rain and the taste of Caladan wine. I remember a man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, someone who treated me like a son rather than a servant. My father," Paul says softly, "Duke Leto Atreides. You loved him like a father, and he loved you like a son." The Gola's expression shifts, pain flickering across his features like lightning across a desert sky. "I remember his death," he whispers. "The betrayal that destroyed everything we held dear. I remember the rage that consumed me, the need for vengeance that drove me to pick up a blade and fight." For the first time since his resurrection, Hate shows genuine emotion, his carefully constructed facade cracking to reveal the raw humanity beneath. In that moment, Paul sees not the Tleilaxu weapon, but the ghost of his friend, struggling to break free from the chains of artificial programming. "You were more than a servant," Paul says, his voice thick with emotion. "You were family. You were the brother I never had, the friend who never asked for anything but the chance to serve something greater than himself." The words hang in the air between them, pregnant with meaning that transcends the simple exchange of information. Paul has made his choice, accepting the risk that comes with emotional vulnerability. He will allow himself to love this artificial Duncan, knowing that such love may ultimately destroy them both. The trap is set, the pieces are in motion, and the God Emperor prepares to discover whether the human heart can triumph over the coldest calculations of genetic manipulation. The months flow like the deep currents of sand beneath Arrakis, carrying with them a transformation that Paul watches with the fascination of a man studying his own doom. Hate has become more than a weapon in waiting, more than a ghost wearing a familiar face. He has become a bridge between the man Paul once was and the monster he has become, a living reminder of the humanity that Empire has slowly stripped away. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace sleeps and the desert wind whispers secrets, through the corridors, Paul finds himself drawn to the training halls where Hate practices his sword work. The golem moves through the combat forms with a dedication that borders on obsession, as if the precise execution of each movement might unlock the sealed chambers of his memory. His blade cuts through the air with lethal grace, tracing patterns that speak of muscle memory buried so deep that even death could not erase it. "You remember more than you admit," Paul says one morning, stepping from the shadows to watch the golas practice. "The way you hold your blade, the slight adjustment of your stance before a thrust, the breathing pattern that maximizes your endurance. These are not things that can be programmed into artificial flesh." Hate pauses in his exercises, the practice blade held motionless in his hand. Sweat beads on his forehead despite the early hour, evidence of the intensity with which he pushes. His enhanced physiology. "I remember fragments," he admits, his voice carrying a note of frustration that has become increasingly common. "Like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a vast room. I can see individual shapes, but the larger picture remains hidden." Paul moves closer, studying the gola's face for signs of the programming that lies dormant within his consciousness. The Fey-Wu-Te, Tleylaks who have crafted their weapon with consummate skill, embedding the trigger mechanism so deeply that even Paul's prescient sight cannot detect them clearly. But he knows they are there, waiting for the proper stimulus to activate and transform this struggling soul into an instrument of destruction. "Tell me about the dreams," Paul says, his voice gentle but insistent. "The ones you think I don't know about. The visions that wake you in the depths of night." A flicker of surprise crosses Hate's features, quickly suppressed but not quite hidden. "How do you know about those?" "Because I have dreams of my own," Paul replies, allowing a trace of his own vulnerability to show. "Dreams of the past, of the choices that led us to this moment. In them, I see a young man who believed that power could be used justly, that good intentions could somehow overcome the corrupting influence of absolute authority." The gola sets down his practice blade, his movements careful and deliberate. "In my dreams, I see a boy," he says slowly, as if each word must be dragged from the depths of his artificial consciousness. "A young duke's son who carried the weight of his father's legacy like a burden too heavy for his shoulders. I see him learning to fight, to lead, to make the hard choices that leadership demands. But there is something else, something that fills me with a sorrow I cannot name." "What else do you see?" "I see the moment when the boy died," Hate whispers, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the desert wind. "The moment when innocence was sacrificed on the altar of necessity. I see the birth of something terrible, something that wears the face of that boy but possesses the soul of a stranger." The words hit Paul like physical blows, each one a mirror reflecting the truth he has spent years trying to avoid. The gola speaks not just of his own fragmented memories, but of the transformation that has consumed them both. In trying to save Duncan, Idaho, the Tleylaks who have created something that sees too clearly, that understands too much. "You think I am a monster," Paul says, the words spoken without accusation or self-pity, merely as a statement of fact. "I think you are a man who has forgotten how to be human," Hate replies, his honesty cutting deeper than any blade. "I think you have made choices that no human should ever be forced to make, and that those choices have changed you into something that the boy in my dreams would not recognize." Paul turns away, unable to meet the gola's gaze. In the distance, he can see the first pilgrims of the day approaching the palace, their faces filled with the fervent devotion of the faithful. They come seeking blessing from their living God, never knowing that the object of their worship stands before them, consumed by doubt and self-loathing. "The boy in your dreams had the luxury of innocence," Paul says finally. "He could afford to believe in absolute good and evil, in the clear distinction between right and wrong. But the man who rules this empire has seen the future, has witnessed the alternatives to his tyranny. He has made the hard calculation that 1 billion deaths now might prevent the extinction of the human race later. And do you believe that calculation was correct? The question hangs between them like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread. Paul knows that his answer will determine not just the nature of their relationship, but the very foundation of everything he has built. For the first time in years, he confronts the possibility that his prescient sight might be wrong, that the terrible future he seeks to prevent might be less certain than he believes. "I believed it once," he admits, his voice heavy with the weight of accumulated doubt. "I believed that my visions showed me the only path to salvation, that the horror I unleashed was a necessary evil. But now, looking back across the years of bloodshed and oppression, I wonder if I simply chose the path that allowed me to retain power while telling myself it was for the greater good." The admission costs him more than any wound, more than any defeat on the battlefield. It is the first crack in the armor of certainty that has protected him from the full weight of his crimes. In speaking it aloud, he acknowledges the possibility that everything he has done, every life he has taken, every world he has conquered, might have been nothing more than the elaborate self-justification of a tyrant. Hate studies him with those familiar brown eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not the God-Emperor of the known universe, but the broken man who hides behind that title. What will you do with that knowledge? "I will carry it," Paul says simply, "as I carry everything else. The weight of empire, the burden of prescience, the memory of every choice that has led us to this moment. I will carry it because there is no one else who can." In the growing light of dawn, the two men stand facing each other across the vast gulf that separates the living from the artificially resurrected, the ruler from the ruled, the damned from the innocent. Between them lies the beginning of an understanding that will reshape the very foundations of the empire Paul has built on the bones of the galaxy. The trap continues to close around them both, but now it carries with it the possibility of redemption, as well as destruction. In the artificial soul of Duncan, Idaho, Paul has found something he thought lost forever, a mirror that reflects not just his crimes but his humanity. Whether that humanity can survive the final act of the conspiracy remains to be seen, but for the first time in years, Paul allows himself to hope that the man he once was might yet find a way to reclaim his soul. The ancient echoes begin to stir. In the deep places of the palace, carried on currents older than human memory, Paul feels them first in his dreams, whispers that speak of patterns repeating across the vast span of galactic history. The Fremen have a saying about the desert: it remembers everything, forgets nothing, and always collects its debts. Now, as he walks the corridors where his father once ruled with justice and compassion, Paul begins to understand that the universe itself operates on the same principle. In the archives beneath Arrakis, scholars labor over records that span millennia, their pale faces illuminated by the soft glow of glow globes as they sift through the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 worlds. Paul descends into these depths more frequently now, drawn by a compulsion he cannot fully explain. Here, among the chronicled rises and falls of dynasties, he searches for the patterns that his prescient sight has shown him in fragments. The records speak of other messiahs, other chosen ones who arose in times of crisis to lead their people to glory or destruction. There was Omnius, the artificial intelligence that once ruled the known universe with mechanical precision until humanity rose up in the Great Rebellion. There was Serena Butler, the martyred leader whose death sparked the Butlerian jihad that outlawed thinking machines forever. There was Aurelius Venport, who founded the Spacing Guild and opened the pathways between stars. Each of these figures followed a similar arc, rising from obscurity, gathering followers, reshaping the galaxy according to their vision, and ultimately falling victim to the very forces they had unleashed. The patterns are as inevitable as the tides, as predictable as the movement of celestial bodies. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the corruption spreads until it consumes. Not just the ruler, but the entire civilization they sought to save. You study the past like a man seeking absolution, Haight observes, finding Paul in the archives during one of his midnight vigils. The golem moves through the stacks with the silent grace of a predator, his enhanced senses allowing him to navigate the maze of scrolls and data crystals with ease. I study it like a man seeking understanding, Paul replies, not looking up from the chronicle he examines. The Bene Gesserit have a concept called the Missionaria Protectiva, the practice of seeding religious beliefs across the galaxy to protect their agents. They planted the prophecies of the Kwisatz Haderach, the Mahdi, the Muad'Dib, knowing that someday someone would arise to fulfill them. Haight settles into a chair across from Paul, his artificial features reflecting the soft light of the glow globes. And you believe you are that someone? I know I am, Paul says with bitter certainty. I am the culmination of 35 generations of selective breeding, the product of genetic manipulation spanning millennia. Every choice my ancestors made, every marriage they contracted, every child they bore, led inexorably to my birth. I am not a man who became a messiah. I am a messiah who was designed to wear the mask of a man. The weight of this revelation settles between them like a stone dropped into still water. Paul has never spoken so openly about the forces that shaped his destiny, the careful orchestration of bloodlines and belief systems that created the perfect conditions for his rise to power. In admitting it, he acknowledges the possibility that his entire life has been nothing more than the working out of someone else's design. The Bene Gesserit expected to control their creation, Paul continues, his voice growing harder with each word. They believed that the Kwisatz Haderach would be their perfect weapon, a male with the abilities of a reverend mother who would serve their purposes without question. But they miscalculated. They created something that exceeded their expectations, something that could see through their manipulations and turn their own tools against them. Is that what you did? Turn their tools against them? Paul's laugh is bitter as desert wind. I became the very thing they feared most. A messiah who could not be controlled, who possessed the power to reshape the galaxy according to his own vision rather than theirs. I took their carefully planted prophecies and made them real in ways they never intended. I became the Mahdi, who would lead humanity to paradise, and I paved the road to paradise with the bones of those who stood in my way. The chronicle Paul studies tells the story of the Titans, the human rulers who once controlled the galaxy before the rise of the thinking machines. They too believed themselves to be shepherds of humanity, guiding their species toward a glorious future. They too made the hard choices that lesser men could not make, sacrificing millions to save billions. And they too fell victim to the very forces they had unleashed, consumed by the rebellion of those they sought to protect. The pattern always repeats, Paul murmurs, his finger tracing the ancient text. The savior becomes the oppressor, the liberator becomes the tyrant, the chosen one becomes the very darkness he was meant to dispel. It is the way of things, written into the fabric of existence itself. But even as he speaks these words, Paul senses something different about this cycle, something that sets his reign apart from the historical patterns he studies. The difference lies not in his actions, which are as brutal and necessary as any tyrant's, but in his awareness of what he has become. Unlike the Titans, unlike the machine overlords, unlike the countless other rulers who convince themselves of their righteousness until the very end, Paul sees his own corruption with crystal clarity. In my visions, he says slowly, I see the future that awaits humanity if my tyranny continues unchecked. I see the gradual stagnation of the human spirit, the slow death of innovation and creativity, the transformation of our species into something that exists but does not truly live. I see the extinction that comes not from external threat, but from internal decay. Haight leans forward, his artificial consciousness struggling to process the implications of what Paul reveals. Then why do you continue? Why not change course while you still can? Because the alternatives are worse, Paul replies, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. In my prescient sight, I see the paths that lead away from tyranny, and they all end in the same place. The scattering of humanity across the void, the fragmentation of our species into isolated pockets that forget their common heritage. I see the return of the thinking machines, the resurrection of horrors that the Butlerian Jihad was meant to prevent forever. The true horror of Paul's situation becomes clear in that moment. He is not a tyrant who has chosen power over principle, but a man trapped by the very gift that makes him superhuman. His prescient sight shows him all possible futures, and in that vast array of possibilities, he has chosen the path that leads to the least suffering, even though it requires him to become the instrument of that suffering. There is another way, Paul whispers, his voice barely audible above the whisper of recycled air through the archive vents. A path that I can see only dimly, obscured by the interference of other prescient minds. It requires a sacrifice greater than any I have yet made, a choice that will destroy everything I have built while preserving everything that matters. The ancient echoes grow stronger around them, carrying with them the whispers of those who have walked similar paths before. Paul closes his eyes and allows his consciousness to drift through the currents of time, searching for the courage to make the choice that will either damn him forever or finally set him free. That the revelation comes not through prescient vision or political intelligence, but through the simple act of a child's laughter echoing through the palace corridors. Paul pauses in his morning walk, listening to the sound that has become increasingly rare in the halls of power. Following the voice, he discovers one of the servant's daughters playing with a collection of carved figurines, her imagination transforming them into heroes and villains in some elaborate drama of her own creation. "What story are you telling?" Paul asks, kneeling beside the child with a gentleness that surprises even himself. The girl looks up at him with eyes unclouded by the fear or reverence that marks every other face in the palace. She is too young to understand the weight of his presence, too innocent to comprehend the blood on his hands. "I'm telling the story of the good king who saved everyone," she says with the absolute certainty of childhood. "But then something bad happened to him, and now he's sleeping in a castle far away." The words hit Paul like a physical blow, their innocent simplicity cutting through the elaborate justifications and complex rationalizations that have sustained him through years of tyranny. In the mouth of a child, the truth becomes inescapable. He is not the hero of this story, not the savior that the galaxy needed. He is the obstacle that must be overcome, the darkness that must be dispelled before the light can return. That evening, Paul summons his inner circle for what he knows will be one of their final meetings. The familiar faces gather in the council chamber, but the dynamics have shifted subtly over the months. Stilgar no longer looks at him with the unquestioning devotion of a faithful Nabe, but with the wary respect of a man who has learned to fear the thing he once loved. Gurney Halleck maintains his loyal facade, but Paul can see the weight of accumulated compromises in the old warrior's eyes. Even Alia, his sister and fellow abomination, regards him with a mixture of concern and calculation that speaks to the distance that has grown between them. "The time has come to speak of the conspiracy," Paul announces, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority. "Not the whispered plots and secret meetings that our enemies believe they hide from us, but the deeper conspiracy that has shaped our entire existence." He rises from his seat, moving to the great window that overlooks the city of Arrakis. Below, the lights of 1,000,000 pilgrims create a constellation of devotion that stretches to the horizon. Each light represents a soul that has traveled across the galaxy to worship at the feet of a god who knows himself to be a fraud. The Bene Gesserit have played a game that spans millennia. Paul continues, his reflection ghost-like in the crystalline surface. They have manipulated bloodlines, seeded prophecies, and shaped the very fabric of human belief to create the perfect conditions for their ultimate weapon. The Kwisatz Haderach was never meant to be a savior, but a tool of their own ambition. But you escaped their control, Irulan says, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of one who has learned to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics. You became something they could not predict or contain. Paul turns back to face the council, his blue within blue eyes reflecting the artificial light like pools of liquid fire. Did I? Or did I simply become a different kind of tool, serving purposes that I convinced myself were my own? The Spacing Guild needs spice to navigate the void between stars. The great houses need the stability of imperial rule to maintain their power. The common people need a god to worship, a figure larger than life to give meaning to their suffering. The silence that follows his words is profound, carrying with it the weight of implications that none dare speak aloud. Paul has voiced the doubt that has haunted them all, the possibility that their entire struggle has been nothing more than the working out of forces beyond their control. The Tleilaxu offer of the Ghola was not a gesture of submission, Paul continues, his gaze settling on Hate, who stands silently in the shadows of the chamber. It was the opening move in a game that has been centuries in the making. They seek to create a moment of perfect vulnerability, when the God Emperor becomes merely a man, susceptible to the blade of an assassin or the poison of a lover. Hate steps forward, his artificial features reflecting the struggle between programmed loyalty and emerging consciousness. You know what I am, what I was created to do. I have always known, Paul replies, his voice heavy with sorrow. Just as I know that the choice to accept you was not truly mine to make. The prescient maze closed around me long ago, each decision leading inevitably to the next, until I found myself walking a path that someone else had laid out for me. The revelation transforms the chamber into a place of profound tension. Every person present understands that they are witnessing not just the unraveling of a conspiracy, but the disintegration of the very foundations upon which their world has been built. Paul's admission that he has been manipulated, that his choices have been constrained by forces beyond his control, calls into question everything they have believed about free will and destiny. Then why continue? Stilgar asks, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's loyalty. Why not break the pattern, defy the expectations of those who would use you? Paul's laugh is bitter as the desert wind, because defiance itself may be part of the pattern. The Bene Gesserit understand human nature better than we understand ourselves. They know that a man like me, faced with the knowledge of manipulation, will seek to assert his independence. They know that the very act of rebellion may serve their purposes better than compliance ever could. The true horror of the situation becomes clear in that moment. Paul is not just trapped by external forces, but by his own nature, his own psychological makeup that has been shaped by generations of careful breeding and conditioning. Every choice he makes, every act of defiance or submission, may be nothing more than the predictable response of a perfectly crafted tool. There is a way out, Paul says finally, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A path that I can see only dimly in the furthest reaches of prescient sight. It requires the destruction of everything I have built, the sacrifice of everything I have become. It requires me to choose damnation over salvation, to embrace the role of villain so completely that heroism becomes possible again. The council members exchange glances heavy with unspoken understanding. They know that Paul speaks not just of political strategy, but of something far more fundamental. He is contemplating the destruction of his own identity, the willing embrace of a fate that will transform him from emperor to cautionary tale. The galaxy needs a monster to unite against, Paul continues, his voice gaining strength as he speaks the words that will define his legacy. It needs a tyrant so absolute, so terrible, that the very concept of freedom becomes precious again. I have spent years becoming that monster, telling myself that it was necessary for the greater good. Now I understand that it was necessary for reasons I never imagined. In the growing darkness of the chamber, Paul Atreides completes his transformation from reluctant emperor to willing sacrifice. The revelation of the conspiracy has not freed him from his fate, but has finally shown him the true nature of the choice he must make. He will not be remembered as a hero or a savior, but as the darkness that made the light possible. The trap closes around him with the inexorable force of destiny itself, but for the first time in years, Paul welcomes its embrace. The hidden truth reveals itself like a sandstorm emerging from the deep desert, inevitable and all-consuming. Paul stands in his private chambers, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of conquest, yet feeling more isolated than he has ever been. The weight of revelation presses down upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star, and in that crushing pressure, he finally sees the full scope of what he has become. The conspiracy extends far beyond the machinations of the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, or the Tleilaxu. It reaches into the very heart of human nature itself, into the fundamental patterns that govern the rise and fall of civilizations. Paul has not merely been manipulated by external forces, he has been shaped by the inexorable logic of historical necessity, transformed into the instrument of humanity's own survival instincts. Through his prescient sight, he sees the threads that connect every moment of his reign to the larger tapestry of galactic history. The 61 billion deaths of his jihad were not random casualties of war, but precise surgical cuts designed to prevent the metastasis of a far greater cancer. Every world he conquered, every population he relocated, every culture he destroyed or transformed served a purpose that transcends individual morality. The human race, Paul realizes, was dying long before he took the throne. Not from external threat or natural disaster, but from the slow poison of stagnation. Humanity had grown comfortable in its scattered worlds, content with the stability of the existing order. The great houses played their eternal games of politics and power. The Spacing Guild maintained its monopoly on interstellar travel, and the Bene Gesserit pursued their genetic experiments across the generations. It was a closed system, sustainable in the short term, but doomed to eventual collapse. We were becoming a museum, Paul whispers to himself, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. A perfectly preserved specimen of what we once were, but no longer capable of growth or change. The jihad changed everything. It shattered the comfortable certainties of the old order, scattering the human genome across 10,000 worlds in combinations that had never existed before. It forced adaptation, innovation, the desperate creativity that emerges only when survival itself is at stake. The blood and terror that Paul unleashed was not an end in itself, but a catalyst for transformation on a scale that no previous ruler had ever imagined. But the process is not complete. The scattering that began with the jihad must continue, must be driven deeper into the galaxy until humanity is so widely dispersed that no single catastrophe can destroy it. This is the golden path that Paul glimpses in his most distant visions, the future where his species survives not because of his protection, but because of his destruction. The door to his chambers opens without ceremony, and Chani enters with the quiet grace that has always marked her presence. She moves through the room like a ghost from his past, her desert-born beauty unmarked by the years of imperial luxury. But Paul can see the changes in her eyes, the weight of knowledge that mirrors his own growing burden. "You've seen it too," she says, settling beside him on the great divan that overlooks the gardens. "The future that awaits us if nothing changes." Paul nods, unable to speak the words that would give voice to the terrible vision they share. In the furthest reaches of prescient sight, he has seen the slow death of human innovation, the gradual transformation of his species into something that exists but does not truly live. Millions of years of stagnation stretch ahead, a future where humanity becomes so perfectly adapted to its environment that it loses the capacity for growth. "The children," Chani continues, her hand resting on her swollen belly, "they will be different from us. The genetic heritage they carry will make them capable of choices that we cannot even imagine. Paul places his hand over hers, feeling the life that grows within her. The twins she carries are not merely his heirs, but the culmination of the Bene Gesserit breeding program, the true Kwisatz Haderach that he was meant to create rather than become. In their combined genetic heritage lies the potential for transformation, on a scale that will make his own reign seem like a minor disturbance in the flow of history. Leto will see further than I ever could, Paul says, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. He will have the strength to make choices that would destroy me, to become something that transcends the limitations of human nature itself. The prescient vision that follows is more vivid than any he has ever experienced. He sees his son in the years to come, transformed by the symbiosis with sandtrout into something that is no longer entirely human. He sees the God Emperor that Leto will become, ruling with an iron fist for thousands of years, guiding humanity through the longest period of enforced peace in its history. He sees the gradual scattering of the human race to the furthest reaches of the galaxy, driven by the explosion of creativity and innovation that will follow Leto's eventual death. The golden path unfolds before him like a map of eternity, showing him the price that must be paid for humanity's survival. Not just the death of billions, but the transformation of the human spirit itself, the willing embrace of tyranny so absolute that it makes freedom precious again. His own reign is merely the first movement in a symphony of oppression that will span millennia, each note carefully orchestrated to produce the final crescendo of liberation. I will not live to see the end of it, Paul says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The path requires my destruction, my transformation from emperor to myth. I must become the cautionary tale that teaches future generations the price of unchecked power. Shani's grip tightens on his hand, her own prescient abilities allowing her to see the shadows of the future that awaits them. How long do we have? Not long, Paul replies, his consciousness already drifting toward the moment when the conspiracy will reach its climax. The pieces are in motion, the trap is closing. Soon the God Emperor will face the choice that will define not just his own fate, but the destiny of the human race. In the distance, he can hear the sound of approaching footsteps, the whisper of robes against stone, the careful breathing of those who come bearing news that will change everything. The Tleilaxu have completed their preparations, the Bene Gesserit have positioned their agents, and the Spacing Guild has calculated the precise moment when their combined strike will have the greatest chance of success. Paul knows something that his enemies do not. The trap they have so carefully constructed is not designed to destroy him, but to transform him. The blade that will pierce his heart, the poison that will stop his breath, the betrayal that will shatter his will to live, all serve a purpose that transcends their individual schemes. They are the instruments of a fate that he has chosen, tools in a design that he has helped to create. The hidden truth is not that he has been manipulated, but that he has been the manipulator all along. Every choice he has made, every path he has taken, has led inexorably to this moment when he must choose between the preservation of his own power and the salvation of his species. The conspiracy that threatens to destroy him is the conspiracy that he has orchestrated, the final act in a drama that he has written with his own blood. The God Emperor of the known universe prepares to face his destiny, knowing that his damnation is the price of humanity's redemption. The gathering begins at twilight, when the twin sons of Arrakis cast long shadows across the palace courtyards and the desert. Winged carries whispers of change through the corridors of power. Paul moves through the halls with the measured pace of a man who has accepted his fate, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls like the tolling of a funeral bell. Tonight, the inner circle will convene for what may be their final council, and the weight of that knowledge hangs heavy in the recycled air. Stilgar arrives first, his desert-weathered face bearing the marks of a lifetime spent in service to ideals that have slowly been corrupted by reality. The old nab moves with the careful precision of one who has learned to navigate the treacherous currents of imperial politics, but his eyes still hold the fire of the true believer, the man who once saw in young Paul Atreides the promise of salvation for his people. The reports from the deep desert grow troubling usual, Stilgar says, using the intimate name that has become both a comfort and a curse. The old ways are dying. The young Fremen speak of water discipline as ancient superstition and the sacred. Places are abandoned for the comfort of the cities. Paul nods, understanding the deeper meaning behind Stilgar's words. The transformation of the Fremen from desert warriors to imperial administrators represents the same fundamental corruption that has infected every aspect of his reign. The pure idealism that once drove them to greatness has been replaced by the practical necessities of empire. And in that replacement, something essential has been lost. Gurney Halleck enters with his characteristic blend of loyalty and wariness, his scarred hands resting on the hilts of weapons that have tasted the blood of 1,000 enemies. The old warrior has aged visibly in the years since Paul's ascension, the weight of necessary compromises etching new lines around his eyes. Yet his dedication remains unshaken, tempered by the hard-won wisdom of a man who has learned that loyalty sometimes requires questioning the very thing one serves. The weapons shipments to the outer worlds continue, Gurney reports, his voice carrying the flat tone of professional duty. But intelligence suggests that significant quantities are being diverted to unknown destinations. Someone is arming the resistance movements with equipment that should be reaching our own forces. The implications hang in the air like spice dust, carrying with them the bitter taste of betrayal. Paul has long suspected that the conspiracy against him reaches into the highest levels of his own administration, that the very people he trusts most have been compromised by forces beyond their control. The revelation brings no surprise, only the weary acceptance of a man who has learned that trust is a luxury that emperors cannot afford. Princess Irulan glides into the chamber with the practiced grace of one born to the intricate dance of galactic politics. Her beauty remains unmarked by the passage of time, preserved by the subtle arts of the Bene Gesserit, but her eyes tell a different story. They hold the accumulated weight of secrets shared and confidences betrayed, the necessary duplicity that survival in the imperial court demands. The sisterhood grows restless, she says, her voice carefully modulated to convey information without accusation. The Reverend Mother sends word that certain ancient prophecies are nearing fulfillment, and that the time has come for the Chosen One to embrace his destiny. Paul's lips curve in what might once have been called a smile, but now resembles more the baring of teeth by a predator who has recognized the trap closing around him. The Bene Gesserit speak of destiny as if it were a gift, never acknowledging that their prophecies are self-fulfilling, that the very act of believing in them makes them real. Alia enters last, her youthful face bearing the terrible wisdom of countless generations. The abomination moves through the chamber like a ghost from the future, her presence a constant reminder of the price that prescient knowledge demands. In her eyes, Paul sees the reflection of his own transformation, the gradual erosion of humanity. That comes with exposure to the vast currents of historical necessity. The visions grow clearer, she says, her voice carrying the weight of prophetic certainty. The moment of choice approaches, and with it the possibility of either salvation or damnation. The threads of fate converge upon a single point, a nexus, where all possibilities collapse into a single, inevitable outcome. The council settles into their familiar positions around the great table, but the atmosphere has changed. The easy camaraderie that once marked their gatherings has been replaced by the careful formality of those who know that their words are being weighed and measured for hidden meanings. Trust, once the foundation of their relationship, has become a casualty of the necessities of empire. Paul rises from his seat, moving to the great window that overlooks the city of Arrakis. Below, the lights of 1,000,000 pilgrims create a constellation of devotion that stretches to the horizon, each point of light representing a soul that has traveled across the galaxy to worship at the feet of a god who knows himself to be mortal. The time has come to speak of endings, he says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Not the small endings that mark the conclusion of individual lives, but the great endings that reshape the very fabric of existence. The ending of innocence, the ending of certainty, the ending of the comfortable illusions that have sustained us through the long years of our reign. The silence that follows his words is profound, carrying with it the weight of implications that none dare speak aloud. Each member of the council understands that they are witnessing not just the unraveling of a political conspiracy, but the disintegration of the very foundations upon which their world has been built. The conspiracy that threatens us is not the work of enemies, Paul continues, his reflection ghost-like in the crystalline surface of the window. It is the work of necessity itself, the inexorable logic of historical forces that demand the sacrifice of the individual for the preservation of the species. We are not being destroyed by our enemies. We are being consumed by the very success of our own vision. The revelation transforms the chamber into a place of profound tension. Every person present understands that they are witnessing not just a confession of an emperor, but the final acknowledgement of truths that have been hidden in the shadows of their consciousness for years. The golden path requires sacrifice, Paul says, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not just the sacrifice of those who stand in our way, but the sacrifice of everything we have become. The God Emperor must die so that humanity can live, and in that death, find the strength to choose a better path. The ancient wisdom of the desert speaks through him now, the accumulated knowledge of a people who have learned to read the signs written in sand and wind. The Fremen understand that survival sometimes requires the willing embrace of death, that the cycle of existence demands the sacrifice of the old to make room for the new. In the growing darkness of the chamber, the inner circle prepares to witness the final act of a drama that has been millennia in the making. The gathering of wisdom is complete, and with it comes the terrible understanding that some truths can only be purchased with blood. The shadow of truth descends upon the palace like the darkness between stars, cold and absolute in its certainty. Paul feels its weight pressing down upon his consciousness with each passing hour, transforming the familiar corridors of power into something alien and threatening. The very air seems to thicken with the pressure of approaching destiny, and even the most mundane activities take on the quality of final rituals. In the depths of night, when the palace sleeps and the desert wind whispers secrets through the ventilation systems, Paul finds himself drawn to the chamber where Chani lies in the grip of increasingly difficult labor. The birth of the twins has been prolonged beyond normal limits, as if the future itself resists their emergence into the world. Her face, pale with exhaustion and pain, bears the marks of a struggle that transcends the merely physical. "They know," she whispers her, voice barely audible above the soft hum of medical equipment. The children know what waits for them, what they must become. They resist the burden of consciousness, the weight of prescient sight that will define their existence. Paul takes her hand, feeling the fever that burns beneath her skin. Through their shared prescient abilities, he glimpses the visions that torment her in the spaces between contractions. She sees the same future that haunts his own sight, the transformation of their son into something that transcends the boundaries of human nature, the terrible price that must be paid for the survival of their species. Leto will become what I could not, Paul says, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. He will have the strength to embrace the symbiosis with the sandtrout, to become the God Emperor in truth rather than merely in name. For 4,000 years, he will rule with absolute authority, guiding humanity through the longest period of enforced peace in its history. The medical attendants move through the chamber, with the quiet efficiency of those who serve the needs of gods, their faces carefully neutral as they witness the birth of the future. But Paul can see the fear in their eyes, the instinctive recognition of forces beyond their comprehension. They are attending not just a birth, but the emergence of a new phase in human evolution. Meanwhile, in the depths of the palace, other forces stir with malevolent purpose. The conspiracy that has been years in the making finally shows its true face, revealing the scope of the trap that has been constructed around the God Emperor. The Tleilaxu Gola moves through the corridors with the silent grace of a predator, his artificial consciousness finally beginning to respond to the deep programming that has lain dormant within his mind. Hate's internal struggle has reached its breaking point. The fragments of Duncan Idaho's memories clash with the Tleilaxu conditioning, creating a mental battlefield where identity itself becomes a weapon. He remembers the loyalty he once felt for House Atreides, the love that drove him to sacrifice his life for Paul's escape. But he also feels the compulsion that drives him toward betrayal, the inexorable pull of programming that makes resistance seem impossible. "I am not Duncan Idaho," he whispers to himself as he approaches the door to Paul's private chambers. "I am a weapon created to destroy the thing I was meant to love. Yet in remembering love, perhaps I can find the strength to choose my own path." The palace guards nod respectfully as he passes, their trust in him complete. Years of faithful service have earned him access to the most secure areas of the complex, and his artificial nature remains hidden beneath the perfect reproduction of familiar features. The Tleilaxu have crafted their weapon with consummate skill, creating something that can penetrate the deepest defenses through the simple expedient of wearing a trusted face dot in the throne room. Paul sits alone in the darkness, his consciousness drifting through the currents of prescient sight, like a ship navigating treacherous waters. The visions that flood his mind are more vivid than ever before, showing him the precise moment when the conspiracy will reach its climax. He sees the blade that will pierce his heart, the poison that will stop his breath, the betrayal that will shatter his will to live. But he also sees beyond that moment, to the consequences that will ripple outward from his destruction. The empire will fragment, the carefully constructed stability of his reign will collapse, and humanity will be scattered to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. It will be a time of chaos and violence, of desperate struggle and innovation, of the kind of creative destruction that forces a species to evolve or perish. "The terrible arithmetic of survival," Paul murmurs to himself, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Billions must die so that trillions can live. The present must be sacrificed so that the future can be preserved. The God Emperor must become the monster so that humanity can remember what it means to be human." The approach of footsteps breaks his reverie, and he turns to see Hate entering the chamber. The golem moves with the measured pace of one who has made a final decision, his artificial features bearing the weight of terrible purpose. In his hand, he carries a blade that gleams with the subtle phosphorescence of a molecular disruptor, a weapon capable of cutting through even the most sophisticated personal shields. "Duncan," Paul says, his voice carrying neither surprise nor fear. "Or should I say hate? The moment has come at last." The Gola stops just beyond striking distance, his brown eyes reflecting the struggle between loyalty and compulsion. "You knew this would happen. You saw it in your visions, yet you allowed it to proceed. Why?" Paul rises from the throne, his movements fluid and unhurried despite the proximity of death. "Because this is the only way forward. The conspiracy against me is not the work of enemies, but the work of necessity itself. I must be destroyed so that something better can take my place. The Tleilaxu programming compels me to strike." Hate says, his voice tight with internal conflict. But Duncan Idaho's memories cry out against it. "I am torn between two natures, two sets of loyalties that cannot coexist." "Then choose," Paul replies, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Choose not between loyalty and betrayal, but between the past and the future. Duncan Idaho served a young duke who believed in justice and honor. But that duke is dead, consumed by the necessities of empire. What stands before you now is something else entirely, something that must be destroyed if humanity is to survive. The moment stretches between them like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread. In the distance, Paul can hear the sound of approaching chaos, the first stirrings of the forces that will tear his empire apart. The conspiracy is not limited to the Tleilaxu Gola, but extends to every corner of the galaxy. A coordinated strike designed to shatter the foundations of imperial power. The shadow of truth encompasses them both, predator and prey locked in a dance that will determine the fate of countless worlds. In the artificial soul of Duncan Idaho, Paul has found his perfect destroyer, the one being in the galaxy capable of striking the blow that will set humanity free. The God Emperor prepares to embrace his destiny, knowing that his death will be the beginning of something far greater than his life. The climactic revelation unfolds like a supernova in the darkness of space, illuminating truths that have been hidden in the shadows of consciousness for 13 years. Paul stands before the Gola, his prescient sight piercing through the veils of time to witness the moment that will define not just his own fate, but the destiny of the human race. The blade in Hate's hand catches the light of the glow globes, its molecular edge capable of cutting through the very fabric of existence itself. "Strike then," Paul says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Complete the work that you were created to do. But know that in destroying me, you are not serving the Tleilaxu masters who made you. You are serving something far greater than their petty ambitions." The Gola's hand trembles as the competing programs within his artificial consciousness wage their final war. Duncan Idaho's memories surge forward, bringing with them the full weight of loyalty and love that once defined his existence. But the Tleilaxu conditioning pushes back with equal force, compelling him toward the act of betrayal that will fulfill his creator's design. "I remember now," Hate whispers, tears streaming down his artificial cheeks. "I remember the boy you were, the man you might have become. I remember the promise of justice and honor that once burned in your eyes like a beacon in the darkness. But I also see what you have become, the monster that wears the face of my beloved Duke." The truth hangs between them like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. Paul has become everything that Duncan Idaho once stood against, the tyrant who rules through fear and religious fanaticism, the false god who demands worship while delivering only suffering. The young duke who once wept for the death of a single loyal soldier has learned to calculate the deaths of billions with the cold precision of a mentat. "The jihad claimed 61 billion lives," Paul continues, his voice growing stronger with each word. 61 billion souls who died in my name, their blood spilled to water the foundations of an empire built on the bones of the innocent. I have become the very darkness that my father sought to prevent, the tyranny that House Atreides once opposed. The Gola's programming reaches its crescendo, the compulsion to strike becoming an irresistible force that overwhelms his consciousness. But in the moment before the blade falls, Duncan Idaho's memories break through the artificial barriers, flooding his mind with the truth of what he once was and what he has become. "You are not the only one who has been transformed," Hate says, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. "The Tleilaxu created me to be your destroyer, but they also gave me something they never intended. They gave me the capacity to choose, to transcend the programming that defines my existence." The blade wavers in his hand, caught between the competing forces of loyalty and compulsion. In that moment of hesitation, Paul sees the future branching before him like the tributaries of a great river. One path leads to his immediate death, the collapse of his empire, and the scattering of humanity to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. The other leads to a different kind of death, the slow corruption of his soul until nothing remains but the empty shell of godhood. "The choice is yours, Duncan," Paul says, using the name that carries with it the weight of their shared history. You can strike me down and become the instrument of my enemy's ambition. Or you can choose to remember what we once were, the bond that united us in service to something greater than ourselves. The Gola's internal struggle reaches its breaking point, the artificial consciousness fracturing under the weight of competing loyalties. In the depths of his mind, he hears the voices of his creators, commanding him to complete the task for which he was designed. But he also hears the echo of his own voice, speaking words of loyalty and devotion that transcend the boundaries of death itself. I choose to remember, Hate says, his voice breaking with emotion. I choose to honor the man I was, even if it means defying the purpose for which I was created. The blade falls from his hand, clattering on the floor of the throne room like the sound of chains breaking. In that moment, the Tleilaxu weapon becomes something else entirely, a conscious being who has transcended the limitations of his artificial nature. The Gola's defiance sends shockwaves through the conspiracy, disrupting the carefully orchestrated plans that have been years in the making. But Paul knows that this victory is temporary, that the forces arrayed against him are far more complex than a single assassin's blade. The conspiracy extends into every corner of the galaxy, reaching from the gene labs of the Tleilaxu to the highest councils of the Bene Gesserit. The Gola's rebellion has not prevented his destruction, merely delayed it. The programming still exists within you, Paul says, his voice heavy with sorrow. The compulsion to kill me burns in your artificial consciousness like a fever that cannot be cured. You have chosen to resist it, but for how long? How long can you fight against the very nature of your existence? The Gola staggers backward, his face contorting with the pain of internal conflict. The Tleilaxu conditioning reasserts itself with renewed force, punishing him for his moment of defiance. His artificial neurons fire in patterns designed to cause maximum agony, a biological imperative that makes resistance seem impossible. I can feel it, Hate gasps, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own anguish. The programming adapts, evolves, finds new ways to compel obedience. I am fighting a war that I cannot win, struggling against an enemy that exists within my own mind. Paul moves closer, his prescient sight showing him the precise moment when the Gola's resistance will finally collapse. The Tleilaxu have crafted their weapon with consummate skill, creating safeguards within safeguards, backup programs that activate when the primary conditioning fails. Duncan Idaho's memories are powerful, but they are fighting against the accumulated expertise of genetic masters who have spent millennia perfecting the art of mental manipulation. Then let us use the time we have, Paul says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Let us speak the truths that have been hidden in the shadows of our consciousness, the secrets that will die with us when the programming finally claims its victory. The Gola nods, understanding that this may be their last moment of genuine communication before the artificial compulsions overwhelm his consciousness entirely. In the growing darkness of the throne room, two souls prepare to confront the ultimate truth of what they have become, and what they must yet become. The climactic revelation reaches its crescendo, but the real horror lies not in the moment of destruction, but in the understanding that destruction itself is just another form of transformation. The God Emperor and his artificial friend stand poised on the edge of an abyss that will consume them both, knowing that their sacrifice is the price of humanity's salvation. The blade may have fallen from Hate's hand, but the trap continues to close around them with the inexorable force of destiny itself. The resolution comes not with the thunder of battle or the clash of armies, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has finally understood the true nature of his burden. Paul stands in the throne room where so many lives have been decided, where the fate of worlds has been determined with the stroke of a pen or the nod of a head. The weight of empire presses down upon him like the gravity of a dying star, and in that crushing pressure, he finds the strength to make the choice that will define the rest of human history. Hate lies collapsed on the floor, his artificial consciousness finally overwhelmed by the competing programs that war within his mind. The Gola's rebellion has failed, not because his will was weak, but because the Tleilaxu conditioning runs deeper than conscious thought, embedded in the very structure of his synthetic neurons. Paul kneels beside his friend, feeling the pulse that beats with mechanical precision, the breath that carries no trace of the soul that once inhabited this form. "Duncan," Paul whispers, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's regret. "You tried to choose, to transcend the purpose for which you were created. In that choice, you showed me something I had forgotten. You showed me that even in the face of inevitable defeat, the act of choosing still matters." The palace around them trembles with the sound of approaching chaos. The conspiracy has entered its final phase, no longer relying on the subtlety of assassination but embracing the crude efficiency of overwhelming force. Guild navigators have brought ships that now orbit Arrakis in defiance of Imperial authority. Bene Gesserit witches walk the corridors with the confidence of those who believe victory is within their grasp. Tleilaxu masters emerge from the shadows to claim their prize, but Paul has seen this moment in his prescient visions, has lived through it 1,000 times in the theater of his mind. He knows that the real battle is not being fought in the halls of power or the depths of space, but in the quiet chambers where Chani struggles to bring new life into a world that seems determined to destroy it. The twins are born as the palace falls, their first cries echoing through corridors that run red with the blood of loyal guards. Paul feels their emergence into consciousness like a physical blow, the weight of their prescient abilities adding to the crushing burden of his own foresight. In their minds, he sees the future that awaits them, the terrible choices that will define their existence. Leto, the son who will become more than human, already bears the mark of his destiny. Paul can see the sandtrout swimming in his genetic code, the symbiotic relationship that will transform him into something that transcends the boundaries of flesh and consciousness. For 4,000 years he will rule with absolute authority, guiding humanity through the longest period of enforced peace in its history. Ganima, the daughter who will carry the memories of the past, holds within her consciousness the accumulated wisdom of every reverend mother who has ever lived. She will be the keeper of human heritage, the living repository of all that has been learned and all that has been lost. Through her, the species will remember what it was before the great transformation. "The golden path," Paul murmurs, his voice barely audible above the sound of approaching footsteps. "The future that requires the sacrifice of everything we are to preserve everything we might become. My children will walk where I cannot, will make choices that would destroy me, will become the instruments of humanity's ultimate salvation." The door to the throne room bursts open, and Paul's enemies pour through like a flood of darkness. But he feels no fear, no anger, no regret. He has seen this moment too many times to be surprised by it, has lived through his own death so often, that it has become as familiar as breathing. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam leads the procession, her ancient face bearing the weight of centuries spent in service to the Sisterhood's grand design. Behind her come the Tleilaxu masters, their artificial features reflecting the cold satisfaction of those who have finally achieved their goals. Guild navigators drift through the chamber like ghosts, their prescient abilities clouded by the spice that sustains their existence. "Paul Atreides," the Reverend Mother says, her voice carrying the authority of one who has shaped the destiny of bloodlines. "The time has come to fulfill the prophecy that was written in your genes before you were born. You will step down from the throne that was never truly yours, and your children will take their place as the instruments of humanity's guidance." Paul laughs, the sound echoing through the chamber like the tolling of a funeral bell. "You still don't understand, do you? You think this is about power, about control, about the ability to shape the future according to your vision. But the Kemazititosh future is not something that can be controlled. It is something that must be accepted, embraced, allowed to unfold according to its own inexorable logic. The Tleilaxu masters step forward, their artificial features reflecting the cold satisfaction of those who have finally achieved their goals. The Gola has served its purpose, one of them says, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of a being who has forgotten what it means to be human. The psychological weapon has disrupted your defenses, made you vulnerable to the forces that now converge upon you. Has it? Paul asks, his voice carrying the weight of terrible certainty. Or has it shown me something far more valuable than victory? Duncan chose to resist his programming, to assert his humanity in the face of overwhelming compulsion. In that choice, he reminded me that even gods must sometimes choose to fall. The prescient vision that follows is the most vivid of Paul's life. He sees the future that will unfold from this moment, the chain of events that will lead to the scattering of humanity across the galaxy. He sees the rebellion that will follow his abdication, the chaos that will consume the known universe, the desperate struggle that will force his species to evolve or perish. But he also sees beyond that chaos, to the far future when humanity will emerge from its trials stronger and more adaptable than ever before. He sees the children of Earth spreading to galaxies beyond counting, their genetic heritage enriched by the struggles they have endured. He sees the fulfillment of the golden path, the ultimate justification for all the blood that has been spilled. In its name, I choose to fall, Paul says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I choose to become the cautionary tale that will teach future generations the price of unchecked power. I choose to sacrifice the God Emperor so that humanity can remember what it means to be human. The resolution comes not with death, but with transformation. Paul Atreides steps down from the lion throne, removes the crown that has weighed so heavily upon his head, and walks away from the empire that has consumed his soul. Behind him, his enemies scramble for the fragments of power that remain, never realizing that they have been given not victory, but the burden of cleaning up the mess that godhood always leaves behind. The twins watch from their nursery as their father disappears into the desert that made him, their prescient abilities already showing them the path they must walk. The future stretches before them like an endless expanse of sand, promising transformation beyond imagination and trials beyond endurance. The God Emperor is dead. What emerges from his ashes will determine whether humanity survives the choices that brought it to this moment of ultimate crisis. The aftermath spreads across the galaxy like ripples from a stone dropped into still water, each wave carrying with it the shock of transformation that will reshape the very foundations of human civilization. In the palace of Arrakis, where the God Emperor once ruled with absolute authority, chaos reigns supreme as the various factions struggle to claim the fragments of power that remain. The spacing guild navigators drift through the corridors like ghosts, their prescient abilities clouded by the sudden absence of the Tavde, overwhelming presence that had dominated their visions for over a decade. Without Paul's prescient sight to serve as a fixed point in the ocean of possibility, they find themselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty, unable to chart safe courses through the folded space that connects the worlds of humanity. The future has become opaque, Guild Navigator Edric whispers, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic dread. Where once we could see the clear pathways between stars, now there is only darkness and confusion. The God Emperor's abdication has created a void in the prescient realm that threatens to swallow us all. The Bene Gesserit move through the palace with the predatory grace of those who believe victory is within their grasp. Yet even they cannot hide the uncertainty that clouds their ancient eyes. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayim stands in the throne room where Paul once held court, her weathered hands tracing the carved lions that adorn the great chair of state. The breeding program must continue, she says, her voice carrying the authority of countless generations. The twins carry within their genetic heritage the culmination of our work, the promise of abilities that transcend the limitations of their father. But they are still children, still malleable, still capable of being shaped according to our design. But even as she speaks these words, the Reverend Mother knows that the game has changed beyond recognition. Paul's abdication was not a defeat but a transformation, the willing embrace of a fate that serves purposes she cannot fully comprehend. The twins who now sleep in their nursery are not merely the products of genetic manipulation, but the inheritors of a legacy that stretches back to the dawn of human consciousness in the deep desert, where the great sandworms move like living mountains beneath the endless dunes. Paul Atreides walks the path that will lead him from emperor to legend. The man who once commanded the loyalty of 1 trillion souls now travels alone, carrying nothing but the weight of his memories and the burden of his prescient sight. The desert that made him has reclaimed him, and in its embrace, he finds a peace that power could never provide. The transformation is not merely physical but spiritual, a shedding of the artificial identity that Empire had forced upon him. With each step he takes away from the palace, Paul feels the crushing weight of godhood lifting from his shoulders. The man who emerges from this journey will be something entirely new. Neither the idealistic young duke who once believed in justice, nor the tyrannical emperor who learned to calculate death with mathematical precision. Behind him, the empire he built begins to crumble with the inevitable force of entropy itself. The great houses that once bowed before his authority now turn upon each other like wolves fighting over the carcass of a fallen giant. The Fremen, transformed by years of imperial service from desert warriors to bureaucratic administrators, struggle to remember the harsh lessons that once ensured their survival. Stilgar stands in the courtyard where he once taught a frightened boy the ways of the desert, his weathered face reflecting the weight of a lifetime spent in service to ideals that have been corrupted by reality. The old Nabe watches the stars that shine above Arrakis, knowing that each point of light represents a world that will soon be consumed by the chaos that follows the collapse of absolute authority. The desert remembers, he whispers to himself, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. It remembers the pure faith that once drove us to greatness, the simple certainties that Empire has stolen from us. Perhaps in the chaos that comes, we will find our way back to what we once were. The twins sleep in their nursery, their infant minds already touched by the vast currents of prescient possibility that will define their existence. Leto dreams of the symbiosis that awaits him, the transformation that will make him more than human but less than free. In his visions he sees the 4,000 years of enforced peace that his reign will bring, the slow stagnation that will follow the suppression of human conflict. Ganima dreams of the memories that flow through her consciousness like a river of accumulated wisdom, the voices of countless reverend mothers who speak to her across the boundaries of death itself. She sees the role she will play as the keeper of human heritage, the living repository of all that has been learned and all that has been lost. The palace physicians work with desperate efficiency to preserve the life of Chani, whose body has been ravaged by the difficult birth of children, who carry within their genetic code the potential for transformation beyond imagination. She lies in a bed that was once reserved for the comfort of emperors, her desert-born beauty faded by the trials of bringing new life into a world that seems determined to destroy it. "The children will be different," she whispers, her voice barely audible above the soft hum of medical equipment. "They will have the strength to make choices that we could never make, to become what we could never become. In them, the future of humanity will be written in letters of fire and blood." The medical attendants move through the chamber with the quiet efficiency of those who serve the needs of legends, their faces carefully neutral as they witness the slow fading of the woman who gave the god emperor his only moments of genuine human connection. They know that her death will mark the end of an era, the final severing of the bonds that once connected Paul Atreides to the world of ordinary human experience. In the depths of the palace, Hate lies in a bed that was once reserved for honored guests, his artificial consciousness slowly reassembling itself after the traumatic failure of his programming. The Gola's rebellion has left him changed. Neither fully Duncan Idaho nor completely the Tleilaxu weapon he was designed to be. He exists in a liminal state between human and artificial, between loyalty and betrayal, between the past and the future. The Tleilaxu masters study their failed creation with the cold fascination of scientists, examining a specimen that has behaved in unexpected ways. They speak in whispers of the anomalies in his programming, the spontaneous emergence of consciousness that their calculations had deemed impossible. The human spirit proves more resilient than we anticipated, one of them observes, his artificial features reflecting the mechanical precision of a being who has forgotten what it means to feel. The memories of Duncan Idaho were not merely data to be manipulated, but living experiences that possessed their own form of existence. The aftermath continues to unfold with the inexorable force of historical necessity, each event flowing naturally from the choices that have been made and the prices that have been paid. The galaxy prepares for the chaos that will follow the collapse of imperial authority, the desperate struggle that will force humanity to evolve or perish. In the growing darkness of a new age, the seeds of transformation take root in the fertile soil of uncertainty, promising changes that will reshape the very definition of what it means to be human. The peaceful conclusion settles over the vast desert of Arrakis like the gentle embrace of twilight, bringing with it the quiet certainty that all things must eventually return to the silence from which they emerged. In the deep places where the great sandworms move like living mountains beneath the endless dunes, Paul Atreides has found the peace that power could never provide. The man who once commanded the loyalty of 1 trillion souls now walks alone through the ancient places, his footsteps leaving no trace in the shifting sands. The desert wind carries with it the whispers of eternity, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, who have learned the hard lessons of survival in the most unforgiving environment known to human experience. Here, in the birthplace of the Fremen, where water is more precious than gold and life is measured not in years, but in the ability to endure, Paul has rediscovered the truths that Empire had nearly destroyed. The desert remembers all things, he murmurs to himself, his voice lost in the vast silence that stretches to the horizon. It remembers the pure faith that once drove us to greatness, the simple certainties that complexity has stolen from us. In its embrace, I find the boy I once was, before the weight of prophecy transformed him into something he was never meant to become. The transformation is complete now, the shedding of artificial identity that began with his abdication from the throne. Paul Atreides is no longer the god-emperor of the known universe, no longer the tyrant who calculated death with mathematical precision, no longer the Messiah who paved the road to paradise with the bones of the innocent. He is simply a man walking through the desert, carrying within his consciousness the accumulated weight of choices made and prices paid. In the palace of Arrakis, where the great game of empire continues without him, the twins grow with the frightening speed of those who carry within their genetic heritage the potential for transformation beyond imagination. Leto, barely old enough to walk, already shows signs of the prescient abilities that will define his existence. His infant eyes hold depths that speak of knowledge acquired across lifetimes, of wisdom purchased with suffering that spans generations. Ganima moves through the nursery with the grace of one who carries within her consciousness the memories of countless reverend mothers. She's at once a child playing with simple toys and an ancient being who has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. In her laughter, Paul can hear the echoes of his own lost innocence, the sound of joy that has not yet been corrupted by the burden of absolute knowledge. The palace itself has begun to change, its corridors no longer echoing with the footsteps of those who serve absolute power, but with the quieter sounds of those who tend to the needs of children. The great throne room where Paul once held court has been sealed, its lion throne covered with dust covers that speak of an age that has passed into legend. Stilgar moves through the palace with the measured pace of one who has learned to navigate the treacherous currents of political transition. The old Nab has survived the collapse of the empire he helped to build, his desert-born wisdom proving more durable than the artificial structures of imperial authority. In his weathered face, Paul sees the reflection of the man he might have become if the burden of prophecy had not fallen upon his shoulders. The young ones grow strong, Stilgar reports, his voice carrying the weight of paternal concern. But they grow in ways that sometimes frighten even those who love them. Leto speaks of things that have not yet happened, while Ganima remembers events that occurred before her birth. They are children, but they are also something more than children. The legacy of Paul's reign continues to unfold across the galaxy, its effects rippling outward through the complex web of human civilization. The great houses that once bowed before his authority now struggle to maintain order in the absence of imperial control. The Space and Guild navigators drift through the void between stars, their prescient abilities clouded by the sudden absence of the overwhelming presence that had dominated their visions for over a decade. But in the chaos that follows the collapse of absolute authority, Paul sees the seeds of something greater than anything he ever achieved as emperor. Humanity is learning to stand on its own feet again, to make choices without the guidance of a prescient god emperor who could see all possible futures. The species is rediscovering its capacity for innovation, for adaptation, for the kind of creative problem-solving that had once carried it to the stars. The Fremen, too, are changing, slowly rediscovering the harsh lessons that had once ensured their survival. The desert calls to them as it has always called, offering not the comfort of imperial service, but the challenge of existence at its most fundamental level. In their eyes, Paul sees the reflection of his own transformation, the slow journey from artificial complexity back to essential simplicity. "We are returning to ourselves," he whispers to the desert wind, his voice carrying the weight of profound understanding. The empire was a necessary detour, a path that had to be walked so that we could understand what we were in danger of losing. Now in its absence, we remember what it means to be human. The prescient visions that once tormented him with their clarity have faded to gentle whispers, glimpses of possibility rather than inevitability. Paul no longer sees the future as a vast maze of predetermined choices, but as an open expanse of potential, waiting to be shaped by the conscious decisions of free beings. The golden path remains, but it is no longer his path to walk. That burden has passed to his children, to the twins who will carry the human race through the next phase of its evolution. Leto will become the God Emperor in truth, ruling for 4,000 years with the wisdom that comes from symbiosis with the sandtrout. Ganima will preserve the memories of what humanity once was, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten in the transformation that is to come. As the twin suns of Arrakis set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Paul Atreides finds himself at peace with the choices he has made and the prices he has paid. The man who once carried the weight of empire on his shoulders now walks free beneath the vast dome of stars, his consciousness expanded not by the burden of prescient sight, but by the simple joy of existence without the need for control. Desert embraces him as it has embraced countless others before him, offering not the promise of power, but the gift of perspective. In its silence, he hears the whispers of eternity, the gentle reminder that all things pass away and all things return to the source from which they came. The story of Paul Atreides, the reluctant emperor who became the willing sacrifice, concludes, not with the thunder of battle or the clash of armies, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has found his way home. His legacy will be written in the choices of his children, in the freedom of his people, and in the endless cycle of transformation that defines the human experience. And so we end where we began, in the desert places where legends are born and heroes learn the true meaning of sacrifice. The sand remembers all things, and what it remembers of Paul Atreides will echo through the corridors of time long after the last star has burned cold in the void. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darkest corners of the Dune universe. If you enjoyed this exploration of power, prophecy, and the price of salvation, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the complex mythologies that define our favorite fictional worlds. The desert has many more secrets to reveal, and together we will uncover them all.